This year marks the 125th anniversary of the death of Vincent van Gogh. And in case you're planning to visit the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, you'll find yourself in the company of an estimated 180,000 international visitors who are wanting to take stock of the artist's legacy. We were the lucky ones. Author, art historian, and artist William Havlicek presented one of our most popular mornings in April with his book and lecture on Van Gogh's untold journey. He has over 30 years of experience. He looks young. He started when he was 7.5, and he has been a college teacher, a museum administrator, publishing and fine art studio production and exhibition. He holds a PhD from Claremont University and is a graduate of the University of Iowa with both an MA and a Master of Fine Arts, MFA. And he teaches at the Laguna College of Art and Design and has lectured often at the Bowers. So it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Havlicek.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It was really good to be back. I was looking forward to coming again because I enjoyed meeting everybody, and also the food I thought was really good. I liked the eggs, and I don't get bacon at home very much, so it was nice having some here. And my beautiful wife, Jeannie, by the way, if anyone wants a copy of our book, you can get one in the back. One thing we were proud to say is that our book, it probably still is at the Van Gogh Museum bookstore. And that was one of the great, really one of the great moments to have that book in such a wonderful place. What I'd like to talk about today really is a broad range of ways of looking at modern art. Even the word itself, modern, can be mystifying because we live in the so-called postmodern age. And one of the authors of an important art historical book said, no, we're now in the postmodern age. And then someone who claimed to be a contemporary artist said, I don't even like the word modern anymore because I'm a modern contemporary artist or a contemporary modernist because I'm revising some of the modernist themes from the early part of the 20th century in which the word modern really meant something. But now modern is out, just like 1950s furniture, which is now coming back in. And then we were in the 60s, we had the word camp. And a lot of kids don't know about camp, but camp was taking something old and making it cool because it was old. And so that was contemporary. But what you're really doing was revising something that was old. So the terms modern and contemporary can be maddening. And I'm not going to worry about the labels. I'm going to worry about a progressive stream that one can find in Western art primarily. And you're going to see images that I'm going to present today, including a few of my own paintings as well, because I thought twice about including them, but they relate very well to the subject, as you're going to see. Let's take a look at some of these images. You'll notice that I've selected images from the 1860s right up to right now, to 2019. So we're looking at a lot of a time period, and I have to move quickly. But I'd like to begin by simply showing you this image. A photograph of a sunflower and paintings of sunflowers by Claude Monet. One might claim that the photographs of the sunflowers is more authentic in a way because it's a more finite record of the appearance of this object. But Monet would beg to differ with you. He would say actually his painting is more real. For one thing, every stroke of that picture had to be thought out. And it shows the intention of the artist to construct it. And it also has a strong three-dimensional feeling, which the photograph doesn't. One of the things about photography is that it can flatten objects, and it can often be the case that an object can be lost in light. With a painter like Monet, he wanted to literally carve space out of light. And in that way, he was continuing a tradition that dated back to the very early stages of painting. Keep in mind, though, that his painting was painted in 1882, which really, in the whole stream of things, is pretty recent. And so what happened in the 1800s is that with the advent of photography around 1820, artists were increasingly exposed to photographic imagery, and they were also being exposed to the art of the Orient, Japanese and Chinese art. And there's a flattening of space that occurs in Asian art that struck artists, especially in Paris, who were seeing some of the early photographs, that there was a similarity between this kind of imagery from the Asian and also photography, where a black can appear very solid and very flat. And the modernists, like Monet, who started to see this connection, started to play with this kind of imagery. And it's a kind of imagery that a choreographer would very well understand, placing flying ladies in the air who look very much like flowers in flight. The idea really is that we can capture in a photographic image things that we normally would not see. We would see the flying figures for certain, but we wouldn't see them locked in space. So what we're seeing really is an illusion that's been caught by a camera. A camera can show us things that we wouldn't otherwise see. That's the flip side of it. In one way it can disguise, in another way it can reveal. And it was with motion photography that many of the cubists began to consider the idea of painting pictures in which motion was suggested by repeating forms and shapes. So when we talk about modernity and we talk about progressive painting, we talk about technology too. And that's often a term that a contemporary, so-called contemporary painter would like to address. That with video, with closed-circuit cameras, with computer, we have access to a technology that is contemporary and of our time. So it is often the case that artists who want to use this kind of technology would be considered contemporary artists. People taking the photographs of the flying dancers from the New York Dance Project would be examples of contemporary photographers who are using very fast reproductive processes that wouldn't have existed even 60 or 70 years ago to this degree. So technology and style are ubiquitous. They do go hand in hand. And when we look at the history of progressive painting, we turn to someone like Edmund Church, who painted this in 1866, just after the American Civil War. We see an artist who was already considering some of the effects of the camera. And when he painted this picture, he shows us an effect of that rainbow that no one had ever really captured before. But he was finding ways using pigment to show us parts of nature that would be ephemeral. But yet, curiously enough, like Monet, he carves out space and he gives us something that would be otherwise ephemeral, a sort of eternal quality. As long as this painting exists, that rainbow is there. In a curious way, the artist can show us things like the camera can, if the artist is trained to do so. And with Church, who spent a great deal of time in Brazil, in South America, he was showing American audiences things that they had never seen before. Rainbows of this quality could be seen, of course, in America, but he had access to the environmental conditions in Brazil, and very much like in Hawaii, that allowed him to see things that we don't always see. One of the artists who's often credited with the advent of modernity, modern art, if you will, is Paul Cézanne, who painted this picture in 1906. We see an arc that reminds us in some way of the rainbow, but if we start to analyze this painting, which is a watercolor, we start to realize that he was building this perception of space and light up with passages of pure pigment laid over each other so that there's a transparent quality that allows us to see into this picture and also to see the surface of it at the same time. In a way, what the artist is doing is something like the stop-action photographer. He's showing us something that he is perceiving, and he's using the language of watercolor to give us an entrance into an object that we wouldn't normally have. Cézanne was someone who was absolutely obsessed with, he called it the envelope, the sensation of air and light. Many people looking at a picture like this would find it already abstracted because there's a great deal of the picture that is left open for our own interpretation. It's sort of like Michael, the gentleman who put my microphone on, telling me that he has frames on his wall with nothing in them, and when people come into his room, they wonder what it's all about. He said, that's for you, because you can imagine what's in those spaces. In some way, that's true of Cézanne too. But what's interesting about Cézanne, he began to merge what he called drawing and painting. He made no distinction between the two. Previous to Cézanne, drawing was a separate thing from painting. Cézanne's the one who said, when drawing is right, painting reaches perfection. It's a very interesting comment. And we can see the lines, we can see the delineation, we can see the skeleton of this picture, almost like an X-ray, but at the same time, we can also see that he's building up form with light and with color. Here's a photograph of Cézanne in contemporary language, and many of the artists who were practicing modern art, they referred to him as Papa Cézanne, and they liked the fact that he liked to hike long distances, and he loved to be out in nature. He was a very active gentleman, and this picture captures some of that stride that he had. And he was someone who thought that painting outside was very important, but he approached it in a very personal way. When we look at this painting of Mount Saint-Victoire, we could look at the tree, for instance, in this picture, and we're going to see that some of the same color that we see in the mountain behind appear in the tree. And he's also putting this painting together very much like a mosaic. It's a very curious looking painting that is partly flattened. We see the mountain writhing up. We see the whole painting spreading out in a way that would remind one in some ways of Japanese art. There is that flattening there. And Cézanne was someone who was responding, I think, also to some of the photographs that he was seeing, photography. But he was also someone who wanted to bring to painting something that was more personal, something that would open doors for painters coming after him. And a legion of painters followed Cézanne, including Gauguin, including Van Gogh, and many others. And they revered Cézanne because he continued with these explorations right up to his death in 1906. But after 1906, everything opened. We're looking at a painting on the left by Cézanne, which took 2 years to produce. It was finished in 1906, and by 1909, 3 years later, Ferdinand Holder, a Swiss artist, was already in a way enamored with Cézanne and carrying him on into another generation. And so Holder, like Cézanne, both found in nature sources of inspiration, but they were able to treat it in a way that was very personal, flattening the space, heightening the effects, stylizing clouds, stylizing landscape, finding a way of bringing themselves into the picture rather than painting themselves out of it. What's important about the advent of modernity into what's so-called contemporary art is that the artist's own perception and own feeling become part of the experience that we have with the work in a more personal and intimate way. And it's one of the signs of the modern age. We care more about people and personalities, maybe sometimes even too much, than was the case for centuries prior. Individuality had its own place, but by the 19th century, personal freedom, which is a big issue now, as we know, the news, everyone's talking about that, talking about issues of gender and so on, which certainly is important. But the interesting thing about the artist is that their own sensibility and their own dialogue with nature became very important to them, and they found very unique ways of doing it. A year before he died, Cézanne worked on several canvases that for most people appear to be unfinished, but I think Cézanne was very happy with them because they come closer to this type of Asian sensibility, almost Zen, where a great deal of the canvas is simply open. It's the original canvas without anything on it other than these passages of paint which are being stacked in the same way that he had used the watercolor. He begins to use his oil paint in thin layers, laid down in a transparent way so that one can literally look through passages and start to see how the picture is being put together. It's as though we're being brought into the process. And that's a very intimate thing. And it's a very daring thing to leave a painting like this in this condition. And yet Renoir, who was a very great painter, said of Cézanne, I don't know how he does it, but he can leave a painting unfinished and somehow it already looks perfect. That's a very interesting thing. And Renoir wasn't someone to leave a painting unfinished, but he said Cézanne can do it. It's as though he knows very much what he wants to do in those unfilled areas. And I think for us who've been exposed to more of this kind of work, we're not troubled by it particularly. I think we even find a certain relief in it. It's a very personal way that goes beyond style, I believe. And that's why when I'm asked what is the difference between modern and contemporary, I usually say it's really semantics. We could call what we're really talking about is progressive painting, and we could label it any way we like. But what we see with Cézanne is someone who's not worried about a label. He's worried about a personal dialogue and getting closer to something that he thinks is very important, perfecting his craft, understanding more of the nature of things. Someone who admired Cézanne enormously and was a friend of him was Claude Monet, who died, by the way, in 1926. He outlived Cézanne by 20 years. That's interesting because when you think of it, Monet was painting right up to the end of his life, and Cubism had already been well out. Picasso and Braque had introduced Cubism as early as 1907, 1908, just 2 years after Cézanne had died, directly influenced by Cézanne and using a lot of that kind of openness that we saw in late Cézanne. Monet was someone who understood the genius of Cézanne, and he was also someone who was, in his own way, influenced by Cézanne. When Monet painted the Cathedral of Rouen in 1894, he wasn't so worried about some type of photographic fidelity to the facade of Rouen. He was very interested in using pigment to suggest light, glowing pigment, not unlike the way that someone like Rembrandt would have used it, piled, desiccated, meaning that he would also take the oil and soak the oil out of his oil paint by putting it on newspapers, having the oil then drained out of the oil, and then being very much like plaster, or able to put impasto down that wasn't reflective, because the oil in oil paint causes reflection. And what Monet wanted us to do was to observe that surface in a very pure way, very much like Cézanne wanted us to observe the transparency of his oil paint and to become a participant not only in the process, but in the media, making that connection with media, something that a jazz musician would have understood, having a dialogue with the instrument, doing things with that instrument like Thelonious Monk and others had done that very few people had ever done before. And it's exciting to be in the presence of someone who's doing this. They're breaking new ground, and Monet was a groundbreaker too. He influenced another generation of American painters, especially in New York, as I'll point out to you as we move along. One of the great late works of Monet was the Water Lily cycle that he completed just before he died in 1926. And any of you who have been to the Orangerie and Paris and so on will know the beauty of being around this great, vast cycle of paintings that are really atmospheric. But when you get close to them, you find out that there are patches of light and color floating on the field. In fact, at times it distressed Monet because he would ask his wife sometimes, am I really making a painting? It's coming out of me in such a direct way that it doesn't remind me of my early training. I feel that I'm treading on new ground. And these pictures now for us are really quite beautiful, but when they were exhibited in 1926, the public thought they were terrible. They had no way of relating to them. It was a language that we now have no problem accepting at all, because we've seen things that are much more progressive and extreme than this. This seems very, very tame to us. But keep in mind that at one time this was radically contemporary. Now we say it's modern, and other people might say, well, it's really postmodern because it now transcends contemporary, et cetera. And so the important thing is that Monet continued with that exploration that became a part of the search. Helen Frankenthaler, who was born in 1928, just 2 years after Monet died, just to sort of put this in place, was photographed in 1964 here. She passed away in 2011. She was very influenced by Monet's water lilies. And her early work, and much of her work, right up to the time that she passed away, close to that, shows the connection. If you look at the painting, for instance, on the right, It's painted using some of the same technique that Monet used in the water lilies in 1926 or so. And if you look at the painting on the left, it's an acrylic painting, which is also the case with the one on the right. Look at the titles of these paintings: Warming Trend and Nature Abhors a Vacuum. It shows us that Helen Frankenthaler was very moved by nature. She loved to swim. She was a very athletic woman. And so when we look at pictures like this, we might not think they have anything to do with nature, but they do. And one of the sub-themes of my talk today is the way that nature itself continued to be a very important theme for the modernists of New York, the New York School, Willem de Kooning, Arshile Gorky, and others. And often that connection is not emphasized enough in history books. It was as though there was something retrograde about loving nature. And yet the truth is that the artists that we most revere, including Jackson Pollock, love nature. In fact, someone asked Jackson Pollock what his paintings were about. He said, well, nature's painting itself through me. Even Mark Rothko, we see a painting by Mark Rothko here in 1957. It's called Brown, Black on Maroon, but when asked about these pictures, Mark Rothko said, I find clouds extremely inspiring, and I look at them all the time. And we see these passages of paint hovering like clouds, and they are dark clouds, and behind them there is an infernal sort of red. And believe it or not, Mark Rothko was haunted by the Holocaust. He was Jewish. He had relatives who had very likely died in concentration camps. And unfortunately, his obsession with the Holocaust was such that his paintings he considered to be tragically beautiful. He took his life, sadly enough, even though he was one of the great painters of the 20th century. He became increasingly depressed when he didn't see reparations forthcoming. He even offered to donate his paintings to Germany if they would open a Holocaust museum in Munich and so on. It didn't happen in his lifetime. And these kinds of things troubled him very much. But looking at this picture and knowing that, suddenly the tonality and the personal feeling that we would recognize in someone like Cézanne toward nature and so on is deepened, because now the weight of history can be felt. In someone like Mark Rothko, there's a pressure that you feel as these forms seem to be pressing down on each other. And he was a man who was very oppressed. On the other hand, if you look at this picture that was made by Vasily Kandinsky called Keeping Quiet, painted in 1924, we discovered that Kandinsky was a musician. And there is a almost musical sense about the way that this picture is structured. Similar colors, there's brown in it as well. There's a geometric and organic properties in this picture. Soft shapes, hard shapes, but above all, there's a feeling of depth and that one gets in this picture that's a bit different than the Mark Rothko. So we would see someone like Kandinsky practicing a form of modernism that's very much rooted in mathematics and geometry versus someone like Mark Rothko, whose sensibility is more organic, coming from clouds in the natural landscape. But both of these paintings bring to us an interior view, almost as though we're able to look into their own psyche. And that's one of the things that psychology, with the advent of Freud's interpretation of dreams in 1900, it changed everything. Artists became very interested in their own dreams. And one of the things about modernity into the 1920s, 30s, and 40s with the people who were doing analysis and so on, is that we were more open to seeing another's interior life, that the possibility that someone could find a way of doing that visually. Musicians can do it with their music, and painters felt that they could as well in different ways. This is a set of pictures that I completed about 2 years ago. I worked on them for a good year. They're big. There's a big set. They're over probably about 12 feet wide put all together, so they're big canvases. And the reason I'm showing them to you is that I too have been influenced by people like Monet, Helen Frankenthaler, and those people, and find myself very drawn to continuing that dialogue I would consider myself a contemporary painter, but my roots go very deep, and so I have a real appreciation for other artists who have done this. Another artist who had a short life, he was only 44, his name was Arshil Gorky. He was very important because he was an Armenian gentleman who had survived the Armenian March, that Holocaust of its sort. His mother died in his arms of starvation. And he came to New York as an immigrant and was a brilliant artist who attracted his own school of followers coming from him. The titles of his pictures and the imagery of the pictures are very interesting. The picture on the left is called The Plow and the Song. He said it was based very much on memories he had of his childhood. You could say, well, how could that be? Well, if you look at the picture, you sense a field and rather organic objects on this field that have a biomorphic reference. Snails come to mind. Body organs and things of that nature, and flowers. It's a myriad of shapes that hover against a background, a sky. And if you look at behind all of those shapes, you do see what could be a sky form, and you start reading the foreground as some type of field. And it is an imaginary picture that had a lot to do with his childhood, he said, because he remembered songs and ancient plows and other things that he had seen in Armenia when he was a little child. And the pictures were an effort to get in touch with something that was lost as an immigrant. And there's a kind of childish joy in these pictures. The Liver is a Coxcomb. It's a different kind of painting. It's a little more complicated, but the title does give us a reference to coxcombs and livers and parts of the body and things of this nature. And it is a lyrical painting. Above all, it's song-like. And if you asked Gorky what these paintings were, he would say they are the equivalent of a song. It's a melody. I don't have to tell you exactly what it is. I'm humming the melody more than I'm giving it a particular narrative. But there's a joyful quality about these bright colors. And the fact that you can't quite make it all out is sort of delightful, because it forces you to spend time interrogating the pictures and allowing them to begin to unravel before you. He was heavily influenced by Cézanne, by the way. Another very important artist was Willem de Kooning, who lived a long life. As you can tell from the dates, he was 93 when he passed away. This picture was taken of de Kooning in 1938. De Kooning and Gorky were close friends, and the two of them were called the Lions of New York. They were some of the most influential artists in New York during the 1940s and 50s. We see a painting on the left by de Kooning, female figure. He said a lot of these images were inspired by cards, decks of cards, the Queen of Hearts and things like that. And when you look at the way that he stylized around her hair and flattened this out, you can see some of the influence of Gorky, but you can also see that he was looking at cards and other things with that flat printing on them. And he liked looking at printed material. There's also a clear connection between the drawing and the painting. We see that he's drawing on top of the painting, and other parts of it are very flat, like Japanese art. On the right, a picture he made 17 years later called Park Rosenberg. He's making a reference to being in a car. I mean, it may strike you as strange, but he said, I love fleeting glimpses. He couldn't drive for some reason, but he liked to ride in cars and liked to look out the window as things were flying by. He said, I wanted to give someone the sensation of being in a car with objects moving. And it was said of de Kooning that his brushstroke looked like it was going 90 miles an hour, but he could control it brilliantly. He had a great energy that he was sustaining. And we see two very different paintings by the same artist. As he progressed, he began to combine the two toward the end of his life. So someone could say he began as a modernist, he became contemporary, then he became a postmodern contemporary toward the end of his life. And he really didn't care too much about style and labels. He's the one who said, the style that I like the most, here's a picture that he painted in 1981, is the style of Matisse, who simply makes pictures that are like songs and doesn't worry about the label. These late pictures, this one's entitled Pirate, has a very joyous quality. It just floats and the bright colors, and it looks effortless, but de Kooning worked very hard on these pictures. There's actually films of him painting, and you'll see him scraping very carefully and moving things. He said, I want the painting to look effortless, but I do it with the greatest amount of effort. And that really is true. And anyone who has studied de Kooning comes away with a great deal of appreciation. He's someone who understood Asian painting. He understood Zen painting. He understood the action of the brush could be very much like a song and a rhythm within a song. Another important artist was Philip Guston, who was a friend of both de Kooning and Gorky, and a close friend of Jackson Pollock. Philip Guston, this photo was taken in 1930, said that of all the pictures that influenced him the most, it was Monet who had the longest influence on him. And if you look at the desiccated brushwork of Guston, he also was taking the oil out of his oil paints, very much like Monet had done, and building up these beautiful networks, almost like tessera. The painting on the left he entitled Passage, and one can feel oneself moving through it. You sense objects, maybe even people, and the fact that it's passage is significant because you can actually move through this visually. On the other hand, Attar is flatter. It's like looking through clouds down on a cityscape. It's almost a view from a plane that you sense there. He's someone who loved the idea of bringing atmosphere, clouds, and that kind of shape language into his work. Someone who, like de Kooning, was capable of working more than one way. I put another one of my works up. This one is not unlike the Guston, who I admire very much. It's a tighter picture in a way. There's a geometry there. There's a sense of two columns on the left, one blue, one more gold or brown, and then moving into it, and there's an X that moves through that connects all of the sides of this picture. The idea is to ask the viewer to step into it, and at the top there's an implied sun. You can see it at the very top, just a shape without any color in it. And it was this kind of innovation that Cézanne often used, and this was a bit of a tribute really to Cézanne too. Other artists who were very influenced by both Monet and even Matisse would be Clyfford Still and Jackson Pollock. Jackson Pollock, if you know his story, was a very troubled man and dealt with severe alcoholism. He died in a tragic car crash in 1953. Clyfford Still also was a very complicated man. Both Pollock and Still were argumentative, very difficult people to work with, and interestingly enough, the paintings are very much that way. There's a certain kind of anger. There's a flame-like intensity and sharpness about them. They don't have that softness of Arshile Gorky, and one can get a very real insight into their psychology by their work, and they aren't trying to hide anything. These gentlemen struggled with some very serious demons, so to speak, and the paintings convey that. These are not pictures that you probably would want on your wall a lot, and they weren't designed to comfort. They were designed to be disturbing. Other paintings are designed not to be disturbing. People like Helen Frankenthaler and many others created work that wasn't that way at all. Paul Klee, who was a very important German artist who had a great influence on art, was an artist who Walt Disney would have admired. Interestingly enough, the Twittering machine, it's a painting on the left, is very, very funny. You can see a little crank, and you can imagine these little birds making sounds because he's using an exclamation point. You could imagine this being a part of an animated film. And if Paul Klee had lived beyond 1940, he would have probably made film. And we already start to see drifting away from recognizable objects in a sense toward a fun stylization, blurring the distinction again between illustration, graphic design, and fine art, which is absolutely fine. It's what the artist's prerogative would be. And Still Life painted the year of his death. He died of it was something called sclerodema, I believe, and it was a disease that put him into a sanitarium where he was only able to paint small pictures. And this one is very revealing because if you study it, you'll find out that it is a bit of a narrative about his illness. At the very top of the painting, on the left, you see a pink organ, and just above it are two what appear to be ants descending on it. He was actually starting to have his organs shut down. And at the very extreme left here, you see a sun shining down, and in the center is a moon. There are figures that look like they could be teak pots and things of that nature, but also could be figures like the one on the right with an upraised arm and maybe one breast. And down below here is a little angel carrying a bag with a cross on it. It's the angel of death arriving. And on the table are all kinds of keys to what may happen in the afterlife. The picture was very, very spiritual in orientation, and Paul Klee was a very spiritually oriented man who used his work to explore, we would say, sacred themes, even the theme of death, which is not something that most artists would probably want to tackle. Some of the extremes in art are worth considering a great deal. Piet Mondrian often comes to mind when people think of the word modern art. The interesting thing is that Mondrian's influence was more on architecture than it was on any kind of art that followed him. There was a purity about his work, very carefully organized, proportionate, and so on. But he also reveals something to us about the nature of color. When you look at this, you realize that you look at the whole painting at once, and you realize that the red is not as intense and powerful as the blue. We know that because a very large amount of red is balanced by a smaller amount of blue and even a smaller amount of yellow, and yet we see the whole. So red is an active color, but it is more less assaultive on the eyes. But let's say it's lighter in a curious way, lighter in weight. The blue is a heavier color and heavier in its own weight. And so we see that painting is in a very rational, almost intellectual way, and that's part of the satisfaction of a Mondrian. It's very intellectually appealing, versus someone like Helen Frankenthaler, whose work is like an entrance into a canyon, into a watery space, into an almost aerial view of a landscape. Two very different views. Both artists would have considered themselves modernist, and they were working in a very different way, one more geometric, one organic. So it doesn't matter. One could even combine organic and geometric, and often is the case. Something that I attempted in this picture. There's both organic shapes and geometric shapes and line and space. And it's a bit of a tribute, and a whole series of pictures, which I am now up to about 159 of this in this series called Sanctuary of the Sun. And it's based on Psalm 19, having to do with the sun being in the sanctuary of the sky. I like very much the idea of it, and it's a theme that means a great deal to me, the way that the sun is warming the earth and the way that we can gain entrance into that and so on. Francis Bacon, Oskar Kokoschka, painting 40-some years apart. Francis Bacon making this picture, head surrounded by sides of beef in 1954. Oskar Kokoschka painted this picture called Bride of the Wind in 1914 while he was carrying on an adulterous relationship with the wife of the great composer Mahler. And it was a dangerous liaison. And it's interesting how Oskar Kokoschka gives us the drama of that relationship and the problem of it. It's as though he's caught in a cycle, in a whirlwind, or even a typhoon, and the way that these forms just swirl around. And interestingly enough, it's almost as though he's peeling the flesh away from his arm and allowing us to see his own vulnerability psychologically. Something similar is happening with the Francis Bacon. So by the 50s, 40s and 50s, with the advent of so much painting, Picasso and other, more and more extreme themes begin to show in painting. But we can go all the way back to Kokoschka in the First World War period, who was already doing that. So that's not something new. We've got 5 minutes left. Okay. Self-portrait with Yellow Christ, Paul Gauguin. We see that kind of tension in Gauguin. Someone who is exploring themes like that already in the 1890s. So if someone says, is that kind of interior dread and so on something new, I would say no. Paul Gauguin was already dealing with his own complicated relationship with religion. And also issues of eternal life and a lot of other things when he painted this great work in 1897, asking where do we come from, who are we, and where are we going? It's a theme that has to do really with meditations on life and death and eternal life. It's a very remarkable, powerful picture. Here's another of my paintings from this series with a multiple sun, in which there was a similar kind of quest that I was exploring too. And finally, we could look even at the 1890s, Ferdinand Hullner, the way that this white light surrounding this figure just pushes back danger and war. It is a pre-war painting, and it is a painting that has enormous amount of power. And we can see that the language of these artists can even deal with something as vulnerable as this young woman becoming aware of the powers of her own body, and this ominous, rather, shadow, and the shadows again used here. Artists were constantly using symbolism, even in the modern period, so there was nothing new about that. Or Katie Kowitz in 1903, already predicting World War I in many ways, and dealing with a very heavy theme, a woman with a dead child. So to say that strong imagery, expressive imagery is not a part of modernity is absolutely not true. And we have many artists who have used some of the most ancient themes like soaring to talk about eternal life and a lot of other things. And contemporary artist Bill Vaiolo, working out of Los Angeles with The Crossing, did a whole series of videos with figures either in fire or in water, suggesting that somehow they live beyond this world. And already Morris Graves in 1940 with The Blind Bird has a bird that's part real and part spirit. It's a meditation on life and eternal life. And we'll end with Van Gogh's Starry Night, which was a similar meditation as well. And he's another artist that was considered one of the great so-called modernists. So I'd like to end by just saying there's nothing new under the sun. All right. Please.
How do modern artists view Norman Rockwell?
You know, there you are. 40 years ago, he was considered passé and a mere so-called illustrator. But a lot of the young illustrators now who are contemporary illustrators are rediscovering him. Suddenly, he becomes very, very valuable. His cachet is going up every year. People are admiring him more and more because they don't have a problem with so-called illustration anymore. They think that it's very possible for an artist to be a very great artist like Andrew Wyeth, who was a contemporary of Norman Rockwell, whose work is now seen as very, very vital. But for many years, both Andrew Wyeth and Norman Rockwell were totally overlooked because their work was so illustrative. Now it's okay. Yes. Yeah. Please. You were first, I think.
Yes. I'm a big fan of Dali, and in particular that painting that you showed briefly. That's
yes.
So I wanted to just hear what your interpretation of that is. That's such an amazing.
Which one?
Thing. Soft construction.
That yeah. You know, this was painted in 1936. If you know the Spanish Civil War, which occurred in 1937, Salvador Dali, there's another part to this title. It's not all there. Self-construction with cooked beans, a premonition of civil war. He saw this as Spain ripping itself literally apart. It's one of the most powerful anti-war pictures Civil War pictures imaginable. This could be the American Civil War too. Literally ripping itself apart. It's a troubling painting. We would say it has tragic beauty. And that's often a theme in modern art. A willingness to take on something that is troubling and look at it. Alberto Giacometti did that too with these skeletal figures. And he lived through both World War I and World War II. And he's like dead men walking. He saw so much depth and so on that he was not afraid to say, we've got to move through it. We have to face this. It's interesting on 9/11 to look at an image like this and to realize what we've lost and what people experienced jumping from burning buildings and so on. Giacometti touches something that should probably continue to touch us. Otherwise, we forget. Those people should not ever be forgotten. That could have been us. We say, there but for the grace of God go I. Any of us could have been in those burning buildings. Yeah.
I really enjoyed your talk this morning. I was an art educator. I worked in a high school teaching art. And I'm wondering, how do you approach kids today with modern art? How do they feel about it?
You know, I think there's probably more openness. I would like to say I'm teaching at an art school. Most of my students are in their 20s. They came out of a high school, a very progressive high school, and they seem to be very open to it. They seem to be able to appreciate that. And what I like about this generation of kids is that they can love Norman Rockwell, but they can also admire Jackson Pollock too, for different reasons. I like to tell my students, you know, you can like cake and you can eat it too. You can like cake and you can also like fruit. You don't have to love one and hate the other. You can like both of them for different reasons. And suddenly the eyes get big. Hey, wow, I don't have to hate Jackson Pollock. I really actually do like him, but my friends make me feel, you know. I think the students are more open in many ways. I like being in the art school. I like being around the students for the most part, for that reason, because there is an energy there, an enthusiasm. Yeah, please.
Stand up, I'm loud enough. Oh. Thank you. First, I would like to say something, and it's a compliment to you. Your words paint the images and the understanding for us.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What you do is so amazing. You carry us through the artwork. You take us on a journey. Each piece is a journey. And when you're done, we understand it and we can go with you.
Oh, thank you.
So I just
means a
have to
lot.
tell you, you totally touched me this morning.
Thank you.
And I always remember the phrase, there's a couple of phrases. Didn't Kennedy say, a civilization is known by its art?
Kenneth Clark said that.
Kenneth Clark, right. Kenneth Clark said that.
Yes.
It's the idea of who are we and who do we see it through the eyes of the artist. And the health of the country
Yes.
is how we view it.
Yes.
And I also remember the phrase, art saves lives.
I think that's true. You know, I'll tell you, very quickly, take me 1 minute. This is a true story. I was a very close friend of Carl Benjamin, who was a very important painter internationally, showed at the Pompidou. He was at Claremont, Pomona, and he was actually one of my committees. I loved the man toward the end of his life. He told me one day that he was extremely depressed for a period of his life, was going to take his own life. He went into his studio. It had beams on it. He was looking for a rope. He was going to hang himself. And his rope was underneath some old paintings. And he started to pull it out. He said the next thing he remembered was 4 hours later, he was fully into this painting that he had pulled out and was horrified to realize that there was a rope in this studio. And he said, you won't believe it, but creativity saved my life. He said it saved many lives. And I was so touched by that. It's a true story. And he told me that with such honesty, and I believe it's true. I actually like the term cultural cultivation. And what that means to me is that we have people who care so much about the state of our culture and our temperament that they want to do everything they can to invest it with the best. Like you were saying, being a fountain rather than being a void. That was so beautifully said. And I so agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll try to ask the question the way I'm thinking of it. I hear your words. I've read your Van Gogh book, and I see the multi-layered approach that you seem to use. The looking at, in the case of Van Gogh, at his influences in his writing, in his and the things that he read.
Yes.
And I look at your painting, and I'm thinking this is a very beautifully thought. Everything is on purpose. So how do you contrast the intellectual aspects of art, with the thinking that goes into it, and the intuition?
Well, that's a great one. For me, they become one. As someone once said to me, I think with great passion. I think with great passion, and I like that. I think a musician is someone who understands this. I think of some of the brilliance of someone like Thelonious Monk, he comes to mind, or Mozart, or Bach. These people studied their material so much that we would say they had an intelligent intuition. Someone once said that intuition is automatic thinking. You've thought about it so much that you no longer have to think about it. And I think that that's true. I think it's true of a great surgeon. I know I had a dear friend, a surgeon, who saved a person's life, who knew that just intuitively this person was dying of some kind of internal hemorrhage. And without any anesthetic or anything, he knew he had to go into this person and open them right up in the hospital bed and save the individual's life. And it was the case. And so, to me, I don't really make a big distinction between it. I think the more that we think, the more that we act, the more it becomes unified. I really believe that maybe at an early stage we have to really strain at thinking, but I think as we move along in our process, it becomes more habitual. It becomes like anything else that we do. It's a good question, though, and I do think that the history of art is multi-layered. It isn't a simple thing. It's very complex, what we all do. And I think that we come away from the creative process by saying, yes, we are all creative in all kinds of ways. And don't think that I think only painters are to be admired or musicians. All people are to be admired. A mother raising 2 children singly is someone who has to be extremely creative. And I admire that person just as much, maybe even more than some painters, because that's very hard. Or teaching high school students. I don't think I'm up for it, you know. I admire people who can do that, you know. It's a good question. I hope I answered it partly. Great. Yeah, thank you.